At our 10th anniversary dinner in a private room off a crowded West Loop dining room, Grant lifted his glass, looked past me, and said, "Some people don't just support your vision, they become it." I felt the room lock before I even turned. That strange pressure shift that happens when everyone hears the blade before they see it. And when I followed his eyes, Sienna Price was already standing. She rose too smoothly for surprise, one hand flattening against her dress, her face calm in the exact way a woman looks when she has known her cue all night. Grant kept his body angled toward her, not me, and let the silence stretch until it started humiliating me for him. Then he said, "Sienna reminded me what it feels like to be understood." No one touched a glass. No one moved a fork. And the only sound in that room was the faint scrape of her chair settling back into place after she accepted my husband's tribute like it belonged to her. I looked at him, then at her, and understood, with a clarity so sharp it almost felt clean, that this had been arranged down to the second. I had chosen every flower on those tables, signed the contract, approved the menu, and written every place card in gold ink while Grant kept saying work was swallowing him alive. Sienna had arrived dressed for attention, and now Grant was smiling at her with a warmth I had not seen turn toward me in months. When I stood, he leaned in and murmured, "Delaney, don't make this dramatic." And I picked up my clutch, set down my untouched champagne, and told him quietly, "Enjoy the rest of your evening," too, before I walked out and left him inside the first room he had ever destroyed without me there to make it beautiful. I built floral installations for hotels, museums, and black tie fundraisers, the kind that changed a room's temperature before a single guest ever took a seat. Grant liked to call us a creative team when donors were listening. But once the check cleared, he slid naturally into the spotlight and left me inside the labor. People remembered his handshake, his easy laugh, his tuxedo. And the terrible part was that I had spent 10 years making sure there was always something beautiful behind him. The studio carried his voice in public, but it carried my hands everywhere else. In vendor trust, client retention, color boards, load-in schedules, emergency substitutions, and the quiet miracles nobody applauds. If a hotel ballroom looked effortless by 6 o'clock, it was because I had been awake since 4, cutting stems, rerouting deliveries, and fixing mistakes before anyone else knew they existed. Grant never learned flowers, mechanics, or timing, because he did not need to learn them while I kept translating my skill into a life that made him look expensive. Sienna Price walked into that life 18 months earlier with a polished resume, sharp timing, and the kind of confidence that made people feel flattered for being chosen by her. Grant brought her into meetings as our venue partnerships director, and within weeks I started hearing small shifts that did not sound accidental. A client saying, "Grant and Sienna have such a clear new direction." A vendor asking whether I still approved final design. I did not call it an affair then, because what I had in front of me was not lipstick on a collar or some stupid midnight text, but a pattern of access, language, and movement. One vendor accidentally forwarded me an email chain where Sienna had redirected floral samples to her personal inbox. Another asked why dinner charges labeled venue development kept landing on accounts tied to my line of credit. And Brooke only had to glance once before murmuring, "This isn't drift, Delaney." I kept my face still and my voice even because panic is how women lose control of their own evidence. And what I had now was evidence. By the time Grant raised his glass at our anniversary dinner, I already understood the shape of what they were building, and I knew it was not love. I took Brooke's folder home and spread every statement across my dining table, separating instinct from proof until the pattern stopped looking emotional and started looking engineered. The affair was there, of course, in restaurant charges, hotel holds, gifts disguised as outreach, but the real story sat underneath it in signatures, account links, and legal responsibility, By midnight, I was no longer asking whether Grant was betraying me, because the documents answered something worse, which was how completely he had built his life on access to mine. The studio lease carried my name. The merchant processor ran through my tax ID. The insurance rode on my policy history, and the website domain renewal billed my card. The delivery van, the payroll bridge, the imported stem deposits, even the emergency purchase line we used during event week traced back to my credit and my personal guarantee. Grant had spent years walking clients through rooms I designed and calling himself the architect of our success, while every hard edge underneath it pointed quietly back to me. Brooke came over the next afternoon, read 3 pages without sitting down, then tapped one reimbursement trail and muttered, "He isn't funding an affair. Delaney. He's financing a replacement." She was right. And once she said it that way, everything sharpened. Because Sienna had not just stepped into my marriage. She had been stepping into my infrastructure. Their dinners were billed as venue cultivation, their weekends as partnership development, their gifts as client retention, and every lie had passed through accounts that only looked mutual because I had been carrying them. Celeste Ward did not gasp when I brought her the documents, did not offer sympathy before strategy, and I trusted her more for that than I would have trusted comfort. She read the lease, the processor agreement, the credit terms, and the reimbursement logs, then leaned back and said, "Do not touch anything in anger. Only separate what is already yours." I nodded because rage makes people sloppy, and sloppy women get called unstable long before dishonest men get called fraudulent. So I scanned every contract, copied every statement, downloaded every portal record, and built a timeline clean enough that no one could confuse it for bitterness. I marked what belonged to the business, what belonged to the marriage, and what had only ever been mine, even when Grant had been spending it like a birthright. By the time he stood up at our anniversary dinner with that glass in his hand, the affair was almost the smallest part of what I knew, because I already understood where the real spine was, and it was money. Grant had not lost control of the room when he raised that glass, because this was not a reckless confession or a drunken slip. It was a launch he believed would hold. Sienna had already accepted her cue, already measured the distance between her chair and the center of attention, already chosen a dress that made her look less invited than installed. Even the seating told on them once I looked back at it clearly, because they had placed her close enough to his line of sight that he never had to search for her. He smiled with the easy warmth donors used to mistake for depth and said, "People change. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is be honest about who has really been beside you." A few guests shifted in their seats, not because they were confused, but because they understood too quickly. And that kind of recognition has its own sound when silverware stops touching china. Then he turned fully toward Sienna and added, "Tonight feels like the right moment to acknowledge the person who has been part of every meaningful step forward this year." Sienna rose again, slower this time, as if she were accepting something ceremonial. And the worst part was not her nerve, but the fact that she expected applause. Nobody clapped. Nobody smiled back. And the room held still around her in that expensive, polished way people freeze when they realize they are trapped inside someone else's disgrace. I watched Grant mistake that silence for suspense, which told me more about him than the affair ever had. He thought he was naming a future in front of witnesses, making me look like the outdated version while he unveiled the woman he meant to slide into my place. Sienna stood there with her shoulders back and her chin lifted, not embarrassed, not uncertain, because women who think they are entering a kingdom do not flinch when the first door opens. I set my fingers around my clutch, felt the stem of my untouched glass cool against my hand, and knew neither of them had understood what they had actually exposed. When I stood, Grant leaned toward me with a sharp little smile breaking at the corners and murmured, "Delaney? Don't do something emotional here." Like emotion had not been the weapon he had just used. I bent just enough to keep my voice between us and gave him the only thing he had not prepared for, which was no scene. No plea. No argument. Just enjoy the rest of your evening. Then I walked through the room I had paid for, past the flowers I had chosen, and out into the night, leaving him inside the first version of his new life that already felt colder than he meant it to. I did not go home after I left the restaurant, because home still had Grant's jackets in the closet, Grant's voice in the walls, and Grant's illusion sitting comfortably inside my labor. I drove straight to the studio office behind our showroom, unlocked the glass door with my own key, and stood there for one long breath surrounded by wire cutters, floral tape, invoices, and the sharp green smell of stems waiting in water. Then I called Celeste, heard her answer on the second ring, and when I said, "It happened publicly," she did not waste a second on sympathy before replying, "Good. Now we move." Everything we did that night had already been mapped, which was the only reason I trusted my hands to stay steady while my marriage was still cooling behind me. I changed administrative access on the website, the client portal, the vendor dashboard, and the merchant processor, not to punish Grant, but because each one was tied to my credentials and had never legally belonged to his charm. Then I emailed our accountant, our insurance broker, and the landlord who held the studio lease, writing the same clean sentence each time, that effective immediately, all matters connected to my guarantee, my tax ID, and my signature would be handled through me alone. Brooke uploaded the reimbursement trail into one secure folder, grouping dinner charges, hotel holds, ride shares, and gifts that had all been hidden under cultivation, development, or retention. I reviewed every line, every approval stamp, every transfer that had passed through an account Grant loved to call ours when he needed protection and his when he wanted credit. By midnight, I had separated what belonged to the studio, what belonged to the marriage, and what had only ever belonged to me, which turned out to be nearly every structure he had been standing on. I did not freeze anything, drain anything, or smash anything, because destruction leaves fingerprints in ways withdrawal never does, and Celeste had been crystal clear about that from the start. What I did instead was remove my backing from systems Grant had mistaken for his own competence, closing charge authority on cards linked to my personal guarantee, and notifying vendors that future approvals required my direct sign-off. He would still have the same face, the same voice, the same expensive vocabulary by morning, but he would no longer have the machinery that made those things persuasive. Just before one, I signed a 6-month lease for a small apartment in Lincoln Park, quiet enough to think in and clean enough that nothing inside it belonged to an old version of me. Grant was served the next afternoon at the studio, and by then, Sienna had already moved herself close enough to his life to believe she was inheriting something stable. I did not wreck his world that night. Not with my hands. Not with my voice. Because all I had really done was step back and let every system tell the truth about who had been carrying it. The collapse did not arrive as one dramatic crash, because systems like ours rarely die in public. They fail in small humiliations that expose who actually knew how to keep them running. A donor dinner opened on the wrong palette, all pale spring tones and soft blush arrangements where the brief had specified a darker autumn room. And by dessert, 3 guests had already asked whether the concept had changed. The next morning, a venue manager called my cell instead of the studio line, exhaled hard, and said, "Grant keeps talking, but nobody seems to know the load-in plan," and I stood in my apartment kitchen listening to the exact shape of absence. That week, another installation arrived late because imported stems had not been cleared on time, and the explanation Sienna gave, some vague excuse about vendor delays, collapsed the second the supplier forwarded the actual time-stamped release request. The truth was embarrassingly simple, because I had always handled lead times myself, always checked customs windows, always confirmed substitutions before anyone had the chance to panic. Grant had spent years performing fluency in rooms I built for him, but once I was gone, people started hearing the gap between sounding polished and actually knowing what came next. Reed Walker was the first person who did not call to gossip, pity me, or test how damaged I was. And that alone made his name feel like a clean surface in my inbox. His email was 6 lines long, direct enough to make me trust it. And the center of it read, "If you are willing to take this on under your own name, I want you for the Winter Gala." I read that sentence twice, then a third time, because it was the first offer that did not ask me to return to anything old, only to stand in something that was finally mine. Grant tried to get ahead of the truth, the only way men like him know how, by telling people I was overreacting, that I had become controlling, that I was trying to punish him for moving on. But those explanations had to compete with bounced approvals, confused vendors, missed details, and one final reimbursement trail Brooke sent to Celeste, showing Sienna had approved weekend charges dressed up as partnership development. Celeste folded those documents into negotiations without theater, without public threats, and that restraint landed harder than any scandal would have, because clean evidence does not beg to be believed. Sienna redecorated the loft almost immediately, replacing layered pieces with expensive-looking emptiness, then posting photographs that tried too hard to prove she had arrived somewhere worth envying. A week later, she left just as quickly, because the cards stopped clearing, the vendors stopped flattering, and the version of Grant that survives without a woman's infrastructure turned out to be smaller than either of them expected. The night I heard she was gone, I set fresh stems into a plain glass vase for no client, no dinner, no photograph, and watched my own apartment soften around me in the first quiet proof that beauty felt different when I stopped spending all of it on someone else. By the second week, people stopped asking whether I was really gone and started asking where proposals should be sent and who could still approve final design. 2 members of the old production team reached out separately, not with guilt, not with speeches, but with the flat honesty that comes after confusion turns into proof. They had watched Grant stall through meetings, watched deadlines slip, watched Sienna answer specifics with tone instead of information, and they wanted to work under someone who actually knew how to keep a room standing. Reed moved next, quietly, with a contract draft sent under my own name instead of the old studio brand. Grant had been wearing like a tailored coat. His note was short, clean, and impossible to misunderstand. "I do not want whatever survived over there. I want the person who built the standard in the first place." I read that line twice because it did not ask me to defend myself, soften the story, or pretend 10 years of credit theft had been some romantic misunderstanding. Grant called 3 times that afternoon from 3 different numbers, and by the last voicemail his anger had thinned into the kind of panic men only find when consequences stop feeling temporary. I agreed to meet once in Celeste's office, where the walls were bare and the cold air left no room for charm. And the first thing he gave me was not grief. He looked at me, held my gaze for one hard second, and said, "You do not have to take this all the way," which told me faster than any apology could that what he missed was access. A month earlier, that sentence would have broken something open in me, but now it only translated him with painful accuracy and then, unexpectedly, with none. He was not asking for us, not asking how I had been, not even asking whether he had ruined something real, because the only thing he wanted restored was the structure that had once carried him. Later, Reed walked me through the empty ballroom for the Winter Gala, handed me the floor plan, and asked, "What do you want people to feel when they walk in?" And for the first time in a long while, being chosen felt quiet. 6 months later, I stood inside a smaller, better studio with my name on the glass. While Celeste finalized a settlement Grant could not charm, delay, or narrate around. He did not keep the brand, the contracts, or the structure he had worn like a tailored identity, because every useful foundation had always traced back to me. I sent one final packet to his apartment. Not sentimental, not cruel, just precise. a clean accounting of every payment, guarantee, and business expense I had carried for us. The last page held one line. I did not disappear from your life. I just stopped being the part you treated as permanent. And that was all. That evening, Reed walked beside me through a quiet Chicago block with coffee warming my hands. And for once, nothing beautiful I was building needed defense. I had a new room, a real name, and a life that no longer asked permission to open. Because the moment I stopped shrinking to keep someone else impressive, everything in me finally had space to bloom. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it felt painfully familiar, I hope it also reminded you that peace can return in ways that feel stronger than revenge. Leave your thoughts below. And if you are rebuilding too, I am quietly rooting for you.